Hi, I'm Keith Whitelock and welcome to Watercolor Workshop. Most of the time when we think about paintings, we think about full color works rather than black and white styles as in pen and ink and pencil. But I'm going to show you today that we can use a very limited palette and come up with a very special look, and that watercolors don't necessarily need bold colors to be successful. I hope you enjoy the demo. Alright, here's the pencil sketch that I've done for this particular painting, and I've indicated the areas that I want nice and dark. One thing that will be a little different about this, since this is a sepia tone, is that again I won't have any really bright colors to pop in here. This will be more like almost the pencil drawing itself or a graphic work. So I've transferred this little crab shed scene to the watercolor paper, and the very first thing I'm going to do is a wet wash of nice clear water in the sky, because even though it will have a limited palette, it's going to be treated the same way as it would if we were going to do full color. Okay, now that it's nice and wet and it's glistening just about the way I want to put on my basic sky tone, which in this case is going to be a very, very light wash of yellow ochre. Now I'm going to want a few little clouds in here, and I'm going to mix those up with just a little burnt sienna, perhaps just a touch of burnt umber to darken them a little bit. And I'll take a look and see how that sky is blending. And these clouds look really dark right now, but as the paper dries, they'll become very much lighter. This will change a good bit once it dries down. Now at this point, I just need to let this dry down completely before I move on. Okay, the sky is dried down. You can see it's a good bit lighter now. It's just about what I want. And I did hurry the process along with this little hair dryer. I find that that really speeds up the watercolor drying process here and there. Now when it comes to the water itself, we're going to do a little wet into wet and a little dry type work at the same time. I'll move in a little, and we're going to take a wash of nice clear water, and I'm going to apply that right across the base of the painting. And I'm going to take the same brush with just a little bit of the same color that I used for the clouds, and I'm going to come up right to the horizon line, and then just pull that little bit of paint around my subject right down into the water area. I'll do the same thing over here. I'll just paint around the dock and bring that color down into the foreground. And where I know I'm going to have a little later some darker reflections from those buildings, I'll put a little of that stain in. I know that there will be a darker reflection from this side of the boat, and I'll bring that down. And then the rest of this I'll just pre-streak with some of that sky color, cloud color. And before I move on, I'll let that dry down as well. Now I've forced that water dry with the hair dryer. I like that. It works fast. The only problem is it's very, very noisy. And it's time to move on to some detail work. So I'll refer to the sketch again. And all of the areas that are nice and dark, I will use some mixture of burnt umber, burnt sienna, and perhaps a little sepia, which is a very dark brown, almost a black brown, to develop the contrast levels that I want. And we can start pretty much at any spot. What I'll do first is I'm just going to generally work from left to right to try and so I can keep my hand out of this. And this will be the shadow side of this boat. So I'll take some color and start filling that in. These Sepiatone paintings are always kind of interesting to do. They do remind me a little of an old sepia type photograph. It really creates a nice nostalgic look, even if it is a contemporary subject. And I'll put the same treatment on the shadow side of the sheds, keeping in mind that I can come back later and darken that if I want. I'll just leave white paper for the front part of the shed just now. I could tone the shed a yellowish color or even turn it into a nice red shed later. But first we'll just drop in these shadows. I can use just the tip edge of this brush to indicate a few, just perhaps panel lines or seams in this old crab shed. And I have a shape sketched in here which will eventually turn into a nice mass of old piled up crab pots. So I'll rough in some of that, and a little bit later I'll come back and paint over those, because what I want is a random bunch of little just blocky brush strokes. We won't try to paint around all those cages. And I'll also take this color and start painting in some of the boards on this old dock. This wide flat brush works good for filling in some of the areas under the dock. That will be a good shadow. We'll leave some little spots where the other pilings might show up. And while I'm in that area, I'll just start putting in a few little wave marks, because I know that will be a darker area, picking up on those reflections from under the dock. And I can also put the first bit of reflections in from the old workboat that's tied up here. And I'll also indicate the cast shadow on top of the water from that. And as this brush is running out of paint, I can indicate the first of my little wave lines. I want this water to have a few little directional waves in it. We want to hint at some motion in the water. So I'll put some little wave forms in. They're fairly light right now. I'll come back later and darken those. And again, where I know that some dark part of the building will be reflecting in the water, I'll try to make those reflections just a little heavier, a little stronger. I kind of like it when these old sheds and waterfront buildings have a rusty metal roof. So I'm going to simulate that on these sheds with some burnt sienna. And I have a brush here that's about 1/4 of an inch flat. I'll angle the painting so I can just touch the brush to the roof and then streak it down in the direction that that old metal would be placed. And maybe there'd be a center seam. And we'll just come back, neaten up the little ridge, and then I'll do the same thing on this shed. First I'll find an angle that I can comfortably drag the brush down. As I mentioned about the crab pots, I have this little bit of yellow ochre. I'm going to actually drag some of that in a random pattern through to simulate the back sides of some of those cages. I'm going to switch to a little smaller flat brush. And see if I can put a little color to the boat windows. And using just a very light touch of this, I will also place in some of the background water that would have just barely showed up behind this junk on the dock. I've got a little patch of weeds that's growing back here on this side, so I'm going to take a brush that wants to splay all the bristles out. It's a very rough old brush. It's been in my collection for a long time. I just call it a weed brush, and I pretty much abuse this. I mash it down, smash it. I do to this poor brush exactly what you shouldn't do to your good brushes, but it will mash out really good, and I find it works really nice for putting in little weed forms. It works for trees as well. And I'll bring this little section of marsh down to there and finish that off with a round brush with just a little burnt umber in it. I'll probably come back and play with that a little more in a bit, but we'll let that dry. I'll switch to a rather small round brush. This is an old number 2 brush. And it works pretty good to hit some of these boat moldings, and will indicate a little bottom paint. And the bottom paint really helps make the boat separate from the water as well. We'll simulate a boat name. And the reason I simulate a lot of boat names is to allow you to use your imagination. Sometimes people can get distracted by little things like that. Sometimes that name can help, might remind somebody of a good thing, and the other end of it is that name could aggravate somebody. So in an effort to keep everybody happy, I like to just simulate a boat name on here and let the imagination take over. And to make this boat separate again from the water a little better, I'm just going to put a little wash here and then get a little clear water and drag that back and let it blend. And then we'll get a shadow on the engine box. But to further separate this from the old building, I'm just going to take a mixture of odd colors and throw them around in this old junk and hardware next to the crab shed. And I'll use some of this dark sepia paint. Van Dyke brown is another really nice, very dark, strong brown that would work well for this kind of a study. There would be a little shadow there, and I want to put that in. Sometimes while painting you can use your brush for a blotter too. You can just take a paper towel, touch it with the brush, that pulls out most of the water, and then put that almost dry brush back in. It'll soak away any extra paint that you really don't think you want. And while I'm right here on this detailed part of the boat, I think I'll put in a couple of little grab rails, spotlight. Perhaps even a classic rust streak on the side. And we'll let that dry and move on to the sheds. Now using some more of that sepia or Van Dyke brown, whichever happens to be your favorite. Strengthen some shadows here in the roof line. And in keeping with my thoughts about letting the brush do the work, I'll switch to another little flat brush. We'll just paint in with 2 brush strokes that window. And I'll rinse that brush and take just a tiny bit of another brown that's floating around in the palette. And again, throw a couple of brush strokes into the crab pot area. Before I let the sheds go, I'm going to take just a little bit of yellow ochre. Put a few random touches of it on the building to give them a little, just a little color and a little texture. Just to finish out the crab pots, I'm going to take a detail brush and we'll just indicate a few little frame lines. Nothing terribly definite in that. They usually have a nice bunch of colorful floats that they wind up and put inside, so I'll just indicate that with some of the bright burnt sienna red. There are a couple of old poles and pilings here that I need to paint in. I'm going to angle the paper, again starting on the far side so I can keep my hands out of the wet paint. I'll just start at the top and bring that paint work down to right where I want it to stop. And while they're still damp, I can go in on the shadow side, trying to keep my fingers out of that wet brown paint. It's kind of hard to see, but it really helps make those little poles look three-dimensional. And I'll also take and flatten my brush out, get that knife edge to it. Hold the paper down and I'll think about exactly where I want this electric wire to come, and then just barely touching the paper and keeping my eye on where I want that wire to go. I'll do a second one. We'll just put a couple of power lines to the pole, and maybe we'll drop one down to the shed. Just a couple of little dots for the insulators. We want to make sure these have some electrical service. And down near the bottom of the pole, I'll darken that where the water and the wave action tends to darken the pilings. I'll add a little water to that mixture, and I know that these are going to have some reflections, so I'll keep the reflections a little light right now. They don't need to be too dark. They might look a little dark. Come straight down from that power pole. And the wires remind me to just put a couple of little mooring lines on this boat. Now, to work with the little pilings, I have a number 10 flat brush. And I've mashed it out so I get a little bit of a nice square edge on it. And I'm going to use that to indicate, again, the main pilings on this whole structure. Again, I'll just undercut these. This will strengthen the visible pilings. It really gives us the illusion that there's quite a few of them under there. And with the leftover paint, I'll just work on that reflection a little. Speaking of reflections, we have to remember that most very dark, striking objects up here will cast some kind of a reflection in the water. and doors and windows are no exception. So I'll come straight down from that window and just periodically throw in the hint of a reflection from that window. Likewise, this window here. All right, now I want to give this painting a sort of a good looking over, and any other odd colors that I see that really don't appear down in the reflections, I think I want to go ahead and start bringing some of those in now. And this is the illusion of reflections. If we have choppy water, we don't really have to worry about trying to get that mirror image that we would with nice still water. We just kind of want to get the essence of these reflections in here. I like to squint at the painting at this point too and see whether or not some parts don't show up. Squinting's a great art tool. It really lets you manipulate what you're seeing in terms of contrast and decide, well, this is too weak or that's too strong, or see if something looks just right to you. Looking at the water at this point, I think it could use just a little strengthening. So I'll mix up a wash and I'll test it down here on the bottom, sort of the scrap portion of the painting. And using a big brush, we'll just try to strengthen some of these little wave lines. Stay consistent with the direction. These little wave forms need to be treated like anything else in perspective. The farther away from us they appear, the smaller we treat them. And it won't take too many of them actually to really create that illusion that the water is back here behind the sheds. And actually a certain number of those little shapes will actually be apparent in the foreground too. I'm reasonably happy with how this painting is coming along now. It's just a matter of fine-tuning a few of these reflections. So I'm going to take a round brush with a little of that dark brown mixture. It's not terribly dark, but I want to start playing with some of these other dark reflected areas. And we'll throw a shadow from the crab pots, or from the crab pots rather, on the building itself. Maybe we'll mirror that little shape. I think I'll throw in a couple of little seagulls here and there. Remember, I don't want this piling pointing directly at the seagull. I'll just kind of put him over here somewhere. He'll just be a little stylized shape. And perhaps another one here. And we'll throw another one in here behind the shed too. I think I like how this sepia tone turned out, so I'm just going to put a little signature on it and declare it pretty much finished. I will go back and look at it, and if there are any little details I want to stick in here after giving it a look, it'll be good to go. Well, I hope you enjoyed that demo. That's a little different look, and it is kind of fun to do. So, join me again here on Watercolor Workshop on Pack 14. I'm Keith Whitelock.